I never imagined I'd be the kind of mother who would be asked to leave her own child's home, not because I'd done something unforgivable, not because I'd hurt anyone, but because I no longer fit into the version of my daughter's life she wanted to live. The night it happened, the air felt too thin to breathe, like the walls themselves were pressing me toward the door. I remember the way my hand shook as I folded a sweater that still smelled like the lavender soap I'd always used, the same one she used to say made our house feel safe when she was little. Back then, safety was something I knew how to give. That night, I didn't know how to hold on to it for myself. My name is Margaret, and I am 62 years old. For most of my life, I defined myself by two roles, wife and mother. I married young, too young maybe, to a man named Robert who had a laugh that filled rooms and a temper that emptied them just as fast. We had our daughter, Emily, when I was 24. I remember holding her for the first time, thinking that whatever mistakes I made as a wife, I would get motherhood right. I promised her, silently, that I would always be there. I didn't realize then how complicated always could become. Robert and I lasted 28 years. From the outside, we looked like a stable family. Inside, we were a slow erosion of patience and unmet needs. Robert worked long hours and drank longer nights. I learned to keep the peace by staying quiet, by smoothing things over, by making excuses. Emily grew up watching me do that, and I worry now about the lessons she learned from my silence. When she was 16, Robert left. He didn't slam the door or shout. He just packed a bag one afternoon and said he needed to find himself. He found himself, apparently, with a woman named Linda, who was 12 years younger than me and very good at smiling in photographs. The divorce was clean on paper and messy everywhere else. Emily was already in college by then, and she took the news with a kind of stunned calm. She told me she didn't want to choose sides. I told her she didn't have to. I meant it. What I didn't expect was how quickly Linda would step into spaces I thought were still mine. She sent Emily care packages during finals. She commented on her social media posts with hearts and affirmations. She called herself a bonus mom, said it like a joke, like it was harmless. I told myself to be generous. I told myself that love wasn't a competition. But some nights, alone in the house that felt too big without Robert and too quiet without Emily, I wondered when generosity became self-erasure. After college, Emily moved to another state for work. We talked on the phone every Sunday, just like we always had, or at least we did at first. Over time, the calls grew shorter. She started mentioning Linda more, Linda's recipes, Linda's advice, Linda's support. I listened, nodded into the receiver, swallowed the ache in my chest. I told myself that Emily was allowed to have more than one maternal figure in her life. I reminded myself that she didn't owe me exclusivity. Still, there were moments when I felt like a guest in my own daughter's story. Then came the year everything changed. I slipped on a wet step outside my house and fractured my hip. It wasn't dramatic, just painful and frightening in a quiet way. The doctors told me I'd need help during recovery. I didn't want to burden Emily, but when she offered for me to come stay with her for a while, I felt relief wash over me so strong it made me cry. She lived in a tidy 2-story house with white siding and a little garden out front. She'd married a kind man named Jason, and they had a spare room they called the guest room, though it felt like a temporary anchor I could cling to while my body healed. At first, everything was fine. Emily drove me to physical therapy. Jason carried my laundry upstairs. I cooked when I could, folded towels when I couldn't do much else. I tried to make myself small, unobtrusive. I told myself this was temporary, that I would heal and go back to my own life. But somewhere along the way, the tone shifted. Emily started correcting me in front of Jason. She sighed when I moved too slowly. She mentioned more than once how independent Linda was, how she never needed help, how she was always so positive. I felt myself shrinking, my presence becoming something to manage rather than welcome. The night it happened was quiet. Jason was out of town for work. I'd made soup and left the kitchen clean, or so I thought. Emily stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her face tight in a way I didn't recognize. She said we needed to talk. Those words, I've learned, are rarely an invitation. She told me she felt like her house wasn't hers anymore. She said my energy was heavy, that I complained too much, that I made her feel guilty just by being there. I tried to explain that I was healing, that I didn't mean to be a burden. She shook her head and said Linda had offered to take me in, but she thought it might be better if I went back to my own place instead. When I reminded her that my doctor hadn't cleared me to live alone yet, she looked away. She said, "Mom, Linda would never put me in this position." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, just a small, precise break. I realized then that this wasn't about the soup or the towels or the pace of my steps. This was about a comparison I couldn't win. She told me I should pack my things and leave in the morning. I nodded because I didn't trust my voice not to beg. I spent that night awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house that no longer felt like a refuge. In the morning, Emily handed me a box for my things. She hugged me, briefly, awkwardly. She said she hoped I understood. I didn't, not then. I walked out with my box and my cane, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give out before my hip did. I sat on the porch for a moment, the sun too bright, the world moving on like nothing had happened. I wondered how love could feel so conditional, how a promise made to a newborn could end like this. I didn't know then that this was only the beginning. I didn't know what losing my place would teach me about finding my voice, and I didn't know how much truth was still waiting to be uncovered on the other side of that closed door. I drove home slower than I ever had before, every mile stretching like it wanted to test how much more I could take. My hip ached, but it was nothing compared to the hollow pressure in my chest. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked the same as I'd left it months earlier, but it didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. It felt like a place that had been waiting patiently to see whether I would come back whole or broken. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and stood there with my box still in my arms, unsure where to put anything, unsure where I fit. The first few weeks were the hardest. The doctor scolded me gently for living alone before I was ready, and neighbors checked in when they could, but nights were long and unforgiving. I slept in a recliner because climbing the stairs felt impossible. I learned how loud silence could be when you replay every word your child said to you, searching for where you went wrong. I kept my phone nearby, hoping Emily would call to check on me, to say she'd overreacted, to say she missed me. Days passed, then weeks. The phone stayed quiet. What hurt most wasn't just that she chose her stepmother over me, it was how easily she did it, how final it felt. I found myself questioning every memory of our past, wondering if I'd imagined our closeness, if I'd mistaken duty for love. I thought about the nights I stayed up sewing costumes for school plays, the afternoons spent helping with homework, the times I put my own needs aside to keep the family steady. I wondered if she remembered any of it, or if it all blurred together into something easily replaced. Linda called once. Her voice was smooth, practiced, full of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes if you imagined them. She said Emily was stressed and needed space, that I shouldn't take it personally. She suggested again that I could stay with her and Robert if I needed help. I thanked her and declined. Something in me, fragile as it was, knew that accepting her help would be another step toward disappearing from my own life. When I hung up, I cried harder than I had since the day I left Emily's porch, not because I felt rejected, but because I felt replaced. As my hip healed, something else started to wake up inside me. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was grief finally exhausting itself. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that I had spent decades being accommodating, being understanding, being the one who didn't make waves. I began to see patterns I'd ignored for years, how I'd softened my opinions so others would be comfortable, how I'd apologized for existing too loudly, needing too much, how I'd taught my daughter, without meaning to, that my boundaries were flexible, that my presence was optional. I started physical therapy twice a week, and with each small gain in strength, I felt a flicker of something like resolve. My therapist, a woman named Carla with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, asked me one day how I was really doing. The question caught me off guard. I told her the truth haltingly, about Emily, about being told to leave, about feeling like I'd lost my place in the world. She listened without interrupting, then said something I still carry with me. She said, "Being a mother doesn't mean you stop being a person." It felt like permission I didn't know I needed. Around that time, I found an old journal while cleaning out a drawer. It was filled with entries from years ago, written in a version of my voice that sounded braver than I remembered feeling. I read about dreams I'd postponed, opinions I'd swallowed, moments I'd endured instead of challenged. It was like meeting myself again after a long absence. I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd let my identity narrow until it fit neatly into the expectations of others. Losing Emily in the way that I had forced me to confront the emptiness that left behind. Months passed before Emily reached out again. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Her name lit up my screen, and for a moment I couldn't bring myself to answer. When I did, her voice sounded cautious, measured. She said she'd been thinking a lot. She said things at home were tense. She didn't go into details, but she mentioned that Linda and Robert argued more than she'd expected, that living with them during visits wasn't the idyllic experience she'd imagined. I listened, saying little, my heart beating faster with every word. She told me she missed me. The words landed softly, almost tentatively, like she wasn't sure they were still allowed. I waited for the apology that didn't come. Instead, she talked about how hard adulthood was, how complicated relationships could be. I realized then that she wanted comfort without accountability, reconciliation without reflection, and for the first time in my life, I didn't rush to give it. I told her I loved her. I told her I was glad she called, and then I told her how deeply she'd hurt me. There was a long pause. When she spoke again, her voice wavered. She said she hadn't meant to throw me out. She said she felt overwhelmed and didn't know how to set boundaries. I reminded her that boundaries didn't have to be cruel, that asking for space didn't require erasing someone else. I told her choosing Linda over me wasn't what hurt most. It was how disposable I'd been made to feel. The honesty scared me, but it also steadied me. For once, I wasn't protecting her from the consequences of her choices. Our relationship didn't magically repair itself after that conversation. Healing, I learned, isn't a single moment of truth, but series of small, deliberate steps. Emily started calling more regularly. She apologized eventually in her own imperfect way. She admitted that Linda had encouraged her to see me as dependent, as draining. Hearing that confirmed what I'd suspected, but it didn't bring the satisfaction I thought it might. It brought sadness, not just for me, but for Emily, who had let someone else define her perceptions so easily. What surprised me most was how much my life had grown in her absence. I joined a community book club. I started volunteering at the local library, helping children learn to read. I laughed more. I slept better. I began to understand that love rooted in obligation feels very different from love rooted in choice. When Emily visited months later, she noticed the changes. She said I seemed lighter. I told her I felt stronger. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one where she used to do homework, and talked like two adults trying to find new footing. I didn't invite her to move back into old patterns. I didn't offer to disappear for her comfort. Instead, I told her what I needed if we were going to move forward: respect, honesty, and space for both of us to be fully human. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I could see she was grieving something too, the illusion that loyalty was simple, that choices didn't carry weight. I don't know what the future holds for us. Some days are easier than others, some wounds still ache when pressed, but I've learned that being thrown out of her house forced me back into my own life. It showed me that my worth doesn't depend on being chosen over someone else. It depends on choosing myself, even when it's hard, even when it means letting go of the version of motherhood I thought I had to be. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that love doesn't thrive where one person is always shrinking. Sometimes losing your place at someone else's table is what finally gives you room to build your own. When Emily left that afternoon, the house felt different than it had after our earlier silences. Not emptier, but quieter in a way that felt earned. I stood at the kitchen sink watching her car disappear down the street, and instead of collapsing into tears, I took a slow breath. It surprised me. For the first time since everything unraveled, I felt like I had spoken my truth without apology. That didn't fix everything, but it changed me. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I existed in a careful rhythm. We texted more than we called, short updates, photos of her garden, questions about a recipe she remembered from childhood. Each interaction felt like a bridge being tested for weight. I noticed she no longer mentioned Linda as often. When she did, there was a hesitancy in her tone, like she was beginning to separate her own thoughts from the ones she'd absorbed. I didn't push. I'd learned that forcing clarity only hardens resistance. Meanwhile, my own days filled up in ways I hadn't expected. Volunteering at the library became a small anchor. There was a little boy named Thomas who struggled with reading and insisted on sounding out every word twice just to be sure. Sitting beside him, guiding without rushing, I felt echoes of the mother I had been when patience came more easily. It reminded me that care didn't have to come at the expense of self. I could give without disappearing. One afternoon, Robert called. His name on my phone still made my stomach tighten, even after all these years. We hadn't spoken much since the divorce, and never for long. He said Emily had told him about our falling out. He said he was sorry things had gotten so bad. There was an awkwardness in his voice, like he wasn't sure which version of me he was talking to, the accommodating wife or the woman I was becoming. He mentioned that Linda felt misunderstood, that she'd only wanted to help. I listened, then told him calmly that helping without respect isn't help at all. He didn't argue. That silence felt like a small victory. A few days later, Emily called again, this time in tears. She told me she'd had a fight with Linda, a real one, not the polite disagreements she'd learned to smooth over. Linda had criticized her for being too emotional, for letting me get into her head. Hearing that phrase, something clicked for Emily. She told me she finally saw how often Linda framed things as concern while subtly positioning herself as superior. I felt a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. No parent wants their child to be disillusioned, even when the illusion was harmful. Emily asked if she could come stay with me for a weekend. The old version of me would have said yes instantly, grateful for the invitation, eager to prove my availability. I paused. I asked her what she hoped the weekend would be. She hesitated, then said she wanted to talk, really talk. I told her she was welcome, as long as we both understood that we were meeting as two adults, not as rescuer and rescued. She agreed, and I could hear the weight of that agreement settling in. That weekend was not easy, but it was honest. We walked around the neighborhood, the leaves beginning to turn, and she told me about the pressure she felt to be perfect, to make the right choices, to keep everyone happy. I recognized that pressure. I'd lived it for decades. I told her how my own fear of conflict had shaped her upbringing, how my silence had taught her that discomfort should be avoided at all costs. It wasn't an accusation, it was an acknowledgement. She cried then, not out of guilt, but recognition. On Sunday morning, we sat on the porch drinking coffee, the same porch where I'd once sat alone with a box of my belongings. Emily apologized again, this time without qualifiers. She said she understood now that asking me to leave had been about her inability to tolerate her own discomfort. She said choosing Linda felt easier because Linda didn't remind her of the parts of herself she was afraid to face. I told her that understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it mattered. It mattered that she saw it. As she drove away, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't waiting for her to return. I was content in my own space, my own life. That didn't mean I loved her less. It meant I loved myself more. Not long after, my health took another unexpected turn. A routine checkup revealed an issue with my heart that required monitoring and lifestyle changes. It was frightening, but also clarifying. Facing vulnerability again, I noticed who showed up and how. Emily called regularly, asked questions, listened. Linda sent a card. I thanked her politely and put it on the shelf without ceremony. I no longer needed to decode intentions or prove anything. I trusted my instincts again. The months that followed were a gradual weaving of new patterns. Emily and I established boundaries that felt mutual rather than punitive. She stopped venting to me about Linda and started making her own decisions about how much access she allowed. I stopped overextending myself in the name of motherhood. When I needed rest, I took it. When I felt uncomfortable, I said so. These changes weren't dramatic, but they were profound. One evening, as I sat writing in my journal, I realized that being thrown out had stripped away an illusion I'd clung to, that my worth was tied to my usefulness. Losing that role forced me to confront who I was when I wasn't needed, when I wasn't chosen. And in that space, I found something sturdier than approval. I found self-respect. Emily and I are still learning each other. Some conversations are awkward, some old habits resurface, but there is a new honesty between us, one that doesn't rely on sacrifice or silence. She sees me now, not as a background figure in her life, but as a person with her own history, limits, and needs. And I see her not as an extension of myself, but as a flawed, growing adult making her way through complicated loyalties. If you had told me, standing on that porch with my box, that losing my place in her home would lead me here, I wouldn't have believed you. I would have thought the ending ended there, with abandonment and regret. But sometimes the ending you fear is just the beginning of a truer chapter, one where love is chosen freely, not out of guilt or obligation, one where you finally take up space in your own life. The quiet confidence I'd begun to feel didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, some gentle, some unsettling. There were mornings I woke up strong, grateful for my routines, and others where a single memory could unravel me. Healing, I was learning, isn't linear. It circles back, tests you, asks whether you really meant what you said about choosing yourself. It was during one of those fragile weeks that Emily invited me to dinner at her house again, the same house I'd been asked to leave. When she asked, my chest tightened, and I had to sit with that feeling before answering. I asked her what had changed. She didn't rush to respond. She said she wanted me there because she missed me, not because she felt obligated. She said she understood now how much trust she'd broken. I told her I'd come, but I needed to know that if at any point I felt uncomfortable, I could leave without it becoming another wound between us. She agreed without hesitation. Walking up to that front door felt like stepping into a memory that didn't quite belong to me anymore. The porch looked the same, but I wasn't. I carried no box, no cane. I carried myself. Jason opened the door and hugged me longer than expected. He apologized quietly for not speaking up before. I accepted it, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it. Emily hovered nearby, nervous, hopeful. We sat at the table, and for a moment no one spoke. Then she asked me how I'd been, really been. And this time when I answered, I didn't soften the truth. I told her about the nights I'd cried myself to sleep, about the fear of being alone before I was ready, about the shame that crept in even when I knew I hadn't deserved it. She listened, eyes downcast, hands clasped. Jason listened too. There was no defensiveness, no interruption. That mattered more than apologies. When I finished, Emily reached across the table and took my hand. She said she was sorry, again, but this time her voice didn't tremble with fear of confrontation. It steadied with acceptance of responsibility. The dinner wasn't perfect. There were pauses that felt heavy, moments when old habits threatened to surface. But there was also laughter, real laughter, the kind that comes when tension loosens its grip. When I left that night, I noticed something important. I wasn't relieved to escape. I was content to go home. In the weeks after, Emily began to pull away from Linda in subtle but significant ways. She declined invitations that felt performative. She stopped seeking validation for her choices. She told me once that she'd started therapy. When she said it, there was no drama, no announcement, just a statement of fact. I felt proud, not because she was choosing me, but because she was choosing growth. Linda, on the other hand, did not take the shift well. She called me one afternoon, her voice tight. She accused me of turning Emily against her. I listened calmly, then told her that Emily was an adult making her own decisions. I said I had no interest in competition or blame. I wished her well and ended the call. Afterward, my hands shook, but I also felt a strange lightness. I hadn't defended myself. I hadn't explained. I'd simply stated my truth. Robert called again not long after. He sounded tired. He admitted that things with Linda weren't as harmonious as they appeared. He said he wished he'd handled the divorce differently, that he regretted how much responsibility he'd placed on Emily to manage adult emotions. Hearing that was bittersweet. It didn't change the past, but it reframed it. I told him I hoped he found peace. That was all. One evening, as I sat alone, I realized that I no longer replayed the night Emily asked me to leave. The memory was still there, but it didn't dominate my thoughts. It had become part of a larger story, not the defining moment. That realization felt like crossing an invisible threshold. Emily and I began to create new traditions, monthly walks, shared playlists, conversations that wandered from the mundane to the deeply personal. She asked me about my life before motherhood, about dreams I'd set aside. I told her about wanting to travel, about writing, about the woman I'd been before I learned to be quiet. She listened with curiosity, not obligation. It was a gift I hadn't known I wanted. There were setbacks. One holiday, Linda was present and tension flared. Emily handled it this time differently. She didn't triangulate or ask me to absorb discomfort. She addressed it directly, set boundaries, and checked in with me afterward. I went home that night feeling respected. That was new. As the year turned, I reflected on how close I'd come to losing myself entirely in the pain of rejection. Being thrown out felt like a verdict on my worth, but it turned out to be a catalyst. It forced me to confront patterns that had long gone unexamined. It taught me that love rooted in fear will always demand too much, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let others face the consequences of their choices. Emily told me once that she was afraid of becoming like me. She meant the version of me who'd endured too much. I told her that fear was valid, but incomplete. I told her she should also see the version of me who survived, who learned, who changed, who found her voice, even late in life. We sat with that for a while, the weight of generations shifting slightly. I don't know what our relationship will look like in 10 years. I do know this. I will not disappear to make it easier. I will not accept being diminished for the sake of harmony. I will love my daughter fiercely, honestly, and from a place of self-respect. And I will trust that the space I now take up is not a threat to love, but its foundation. By the time spring arrived, something inside me had settled. Not in a resigned way, but in a rooted one. I noticed it in small moments, how I no longer flinched when my phone rang, how I could walk past the guest room without remembering the nights I'd cried there in Emily's house, how my reflection looked steadier somehow. The woman looking back at me wasn't younger, but she was clearer. Emily and I continued rebuilding, but at a pace that honored reality instead of nostalgia. We no longer tried to recreate the closeness we once had. Instead, we let something new take shape. There was less urgency, less fear of losing each other. I realized how much of my old anxiety had come from believing that love had to be constantly proven. Now, silence between us didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like trust. One afternoon, Emily asked if I would consider coming with her to a therapy session. She said she wanted her therapist to understand our dynamic better, and she wanted me there, not to defend myself, but to be seen. I hesitated. Old instincts stirred, warning me about stepping into spaces where I might once again minimize myself. But I also sensed that this request was different. It wasn't about fixing her, it was about understanding each other. The session was uncomfortable in the way that real honesty often is. Emily spoke about her fear of disappointing people, about how she'd learned to read the room before she learned to read herself. The therapist asked me what it had been like to raise a child while suppressing my own needs. I told the truth. I said it had felt noble at the time, necessary, but it had also been lonely, and that loneliness had seeped into the way I loved. Emily cried when she heard that, not because she felt blamed, but because she finally understood the cost. Afterward, we sat in the car for a long time before starting the engine. Emily said she was sorry, not just for asking me to leave, but for not seeing me sooner. I told her forgiveness wasn't a single act, it was a practice, one I was willing to keep showing up for, as long as I didn't have to disappear to do it. That summer, I took my first trip alone. Nothing extravagant, just a small coastal town a few hours away. I walked along the water, ate meals by myself without feeling awkward, and filled pages of my journal with thoughts I'd never allowed myself to finish before. I realized how much of my life I'd postponed, waiting for permission that was never coming. Standing there, watching the tide pull back and return, I felt a sense of agency I hadn't known before. I wasn't reclaiming something I'd lost, I was discovering something new. Emily called me while I was away. She sounded lighter. She told me she'd had a difficult conversation with Linda and Robert, one that ended with her choosing distance rather than confrontation. She said she finally understood that loyalty didn't have to mean self-betrayal. I listened, proud but careful not to take credit. This was her work, her growth. I was no longer the silent witness or the emotional safety net. I was a participant, equal and whole. When I returned home, I found a letter in my mailbox. It was from Linda. She wrote about feeling threatened, about not understanding why Emily had changed, about believing she'd only tried to help. As I read it, I noticed something surprising. I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel the urge to explain myself or soften the truth. I felt compassion, distant but genuine. Linda was someone who needed control to feel secure. That had nothing to do with me anymore. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, not as evidence, but as closure. The real test came during the holidays. For the first time, Emily chose to split her time in a way that honored her needs rather than expectations. She spent Christmas morning with Jason's family, Christmas afternoon with me, and declined the larger gathering at Robert and Linda's. When she told me, there was no apology in her voice, just clarity. We cooked together, played old music, and talked late into the night. It wasn't loud or performative, it was peaceful. That peace felt earned. As the year drew to a close, I reflected on how drastically my understanding of motherhood had changed. I used to believe it meant endless availability, self-sacrifice without limit, love that endured anything without question. Now I understood that real love requires boundaries, even when they're uncomfortable, especially then. Teaching my daughter to respect me meant learning to respect myself first. That lesson had come late, but it came honestly. I thought often about the night I was asked to leave, how certain Emily had been, how small I felt. That version of me still lived somewhere inside, tender and cautious, but she no longer made my decisions. The woman guiding my life now knew that rejection doesn't always mean unworthiness. Sometimes it means a chapter has ended because it no longer serves who you're becoming. Emily and I aren't perfect. We may never be, but we are real with each other now. There is space for disagreement, for distance, for growth that doesn't revolve around guilt. And in that space, love feels sturdier than it ever did when I was trying to earn it. If there's one thing I know for certain, it's this: being chosen by someone else will never matter as much as choosing yourself. My daughter once threw me out of her house. In doing so, she unknowingly gave me back my life. And from that place of wholeness, I can finally love her, not as a sacrifice, but as a choice. There's a strange moment that happens after a long season of pain when you realize you're no longer bracing for the next blow. I noticed it one morning while making coffee. The sunlight came through the kitchen window just right, and instead of thinking about who wasn't there or what might go wrong, I simply stood and enjoyed the warmth. It felt ordinary, and after everything, ordinary felt like a miracle. Emily and I had settled into something steady, not intense, not fragile, just steady. We spoke once or twice a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. There was no panic attached to the gaps anymore. When she didn't call, I didn't spiral. When she did, I didn't overgive. That balance was new for both of us. One afternoon, she asked me a question that stopped me cold. She said, "Mom, were you lonely when I was growing up?" It wasn't accusatory, it was curious. I thought about lying, about protecting her from that truth the way I always had, but I didn't. I told her yes. I told her I'd loved being her mother more than anything, but that I'd often felt invisible as a woman, that I'd made myself smaller so the family could feel bigger. She listened quietly, then said, "I think I learned that." Her voice cracked, not with blame, but recognition. That conversation marked another shift. Emily began to examine her marriage more honestly, not because Jason was unkind, he wasn't, but because she realized how easily she slipped into old patterns of over-accommodation. She told me she was practicing saying no, practicing sitting with discomfort. I smiled when she said it because I knew how hard that work was. I also knew how necessary. Around that time, I was invited to speak at the library's small community group. They asked if I'd share my experience with caregiving, aging, and reinvention. Standing in front of those faces, women and men who carried their own quiet griefs, I felt nervous but grounded. I spoke about losing roles, about how identity can narrow until you barely recognize yourself, and about how painful moments can become turning points if you let them. When I finished, several people came up to thank me. One woman hugged me and whispered, "I thought it was too late." I told her it wasn't. I meant it. Emily came to one of my talks later that month. She sat in the back, quiet, attentive. Afterward, she hugged me and said she was proud of me. The words landed differently than they would have years ago. They didn't feel like validation I needed to survive. They felt like a gift I could accept without clinging to. Linda faded into the background of our lives, not dramatically, just gradually. Emily stopped updating me about her altogether. Robert sent a holiday card. I sent one back, polite, distant, peaceful. I no longer needed distance to punish anyone. I needed it to protect what I'd built. The anniversary of the night I was asked to leave came and went without fanfare. I didn't mark it on the calendar. I didn't replay it in my mind. I only realized the date had passed when I noticed how calm I felt. Healing doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up as quiet. Emily and I took a short trip together that fall, just 2 days, a small town, shared meals, long walks. There were moments of awkwardness, of course. Old reflexes don't disappear overnight. But there was also laughter that didn't feel forced, silence that didn't feel dangerous. One evening, she admitted she'd been afraid I would punish her forever by pulling away. I told her I had pulled away, but not to hurt her, to save myself. She nodded, understanding more than she ever had before. On the drive home, she thanked me for not chasing me when she pushed me away. I thought about that, how restraint had felt like loss at the time, how stepping back had felt like failure. But it hadn't been either. It had been an act of faith in myself and in her ability to grow. Now, when I look back on the woman standing on that porch with a box of her belongings, I don't see weakness. I see someone at the edge of transformation, even if she didn't know it yet. She thought she was being discarded. She didn't realize she was being released from old roles, old silences, old expectations that no longer fit. My daughter chose her stepmother over me once. That truth will always be part of our story. But it is no longer the whole story. The ending I once feared, being alone, forgotten, never came to pass. Instead, I gained something I didn't know how to ask for before: dignity, voice, and a relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's too late to reclaim yourself, whether being pushed aside means you no longer matter, hear me clearly. Sometimes the door closing behind you is the only way you learn how strong you are without leaning on it. And sometimes the people who walk away are the very ones who force you to finally come home to yourself. There's a point in life when you stop measuring progress by how others respond to you and start noticing how you respond to yourself. I didn't realize I'd reached that point until one quiet afternoon when Emily canceled plans at the last minute. The old version of me would have swallowed disappointment, told her it was fine, and then sat with the ache for days, wondering what I'd done wrong. This time, I felt the disappointment, acknowledged it, and then made myself a cup of tea and went on with my evening. I didn't spiral. I didn't shrink. I simply adjusted. That, more than anything, told me how far I'd come. Emily noticed the change, too. She mentioned once that I seemed calmer, less reactive. I told her it was because I'd stopped living in anticipation of loss. When you've already lost what you feared most, you learn that survival doesn't depend on constant vigilance. It depends on presence, on honesty, on letting life unfold without gripping it too tightly. That winter, Emily faced a decision that tested everything she'd been learning. Jason was offered a job in another state, a good job, better pay, more prestige, the kind of opportunity that comes with expectations and unspoken pressure. She called me, conflicted, unsure whether to uproot her life or stay where she'd finally begun to feel grounded. As she talked, I recognized the familiar strain in her voice, the weight of trying to make the right choice for everyone. I listened, then asked her a question no one had ever asked me when I was her age. I asked, "What do you want if no one else's feelings were part of the equation?" There was a long pause. Then she said she didn't know. I told her that was okay, that not knowing wasn't failure. It was the beginning of honesty. Weeks later, she told me they'd decided to move, not because she felt she had to, but because she wanted to try. She said she'd made the decision slowly, intentionally, with her own voice included. I told her I was proud of her, not for the choice itself, but for how she'd made it. When we hung up, I felt something settle in me. This was what breaking generational patterns looked like. Not perfection, awareness. The move meant distance again, physical distance, the kind that once terrified me. But this time, it didn't feel like abandonment. It felt like life expanding. Emily and I talked about what staying connected would look like. We set expectations instead of assumptions, visits instead of vague promises. When she left, I missed her, but I didn't feel erased. Living alone no longer felt like a consequence, it felt like a choice. I filled my days with things that mattered to me. I continued speaking at small gatherings, mentoring younger women who were standing at the edges of their own reckonings. I started writing more seriously, not for publication, but for truth. Putting words to experiences I'd buried for years felt like stitching myself back together. One evening, I received an email from a woman who'd heard my story at the library. She wrote that her daughter had cut her off, that she blamed herself every day, that she didn't know how to move forward without hope of reconciliation. I wrote back carefully. I told her that hope doesn't have to mean waiting. Sometimes hope means living well anyway, loving yourself anyway, trusting that your worth isn't determined by someone else's readiness. That summer, Emily visited that summer. She seemed older somehow, not in years, but in presence. We walked by the water again like we had before, and she told me she finally understood why I hadn't chased her when she pushed me away. She said she needed to feel the weight of her choices without someone cushioning the fall. She said it had made her stronger. Hearing that, I felt a quiet relief, not vindication, just peace. We talked about Linda, briefly. Emily said there was still distance there, and she was okay with it. She no longer felt responsible for managing adult emotions that weren't hers. I smiled when she said that. It was a sentence I'd spent most of my life learning. As the visit ended, Emily hugged me and said something that stayed with me. She said, "You're not just my mom anymore. You're someone I look up to." The words were simple, but they carried a depth that years of obligation never had. I didn't respond right away. I just held her, breathing in the moment without trying to preserve it. After she left, I sat on my porch as the sun went down. The same porch where I'd once felt discarded, the same steps where I'd questioned my worth. I thought about how much that place had witnessed: pain, courage, release. I realized then that closure isn't about things going back to how they were. It's about accepting how they are and choosing to move forward without bitterness. My daughter once chose her stepmother over me. That choice hurt in ways I wouldn't wish on anyone, but it also forced both of us to confront truths we'd been avoiding. It dismantled illusions. It made room for growth. And in the end, it gave us a relationship built on honesty instead of habit. If you're standing in the aftermath of rejection, feeling like you've been replaced or forgotten, know this: your story isn't over. Sometimes the most painful chapters exist to remind you of your own voice. Sometimes losing your place in someone else's life is the very thing that teaches you to fully inhabit your own. Time has a way of softening sharp edges, not by erasing them, but by teaching you how to live with their shape. As the months passed after Emily's move, our relationship settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. We scheduled calls instead of assuming availability. We shared updates without expecting immediate responses. There was an ease to it that would have felt impossible years earlier. I no longer mistook constant contact for closeness. I understood now that distance doesn't have to mean disconnection. Living on my own continued to surprise me. I rearranged the furniture one afternoon, something I'd never bothered to do when others' preferences always came first. I painted the spare room a soft blue and turned it into a writing space. I filled it with books, notebooks, and a chair by the window. Sitting there, pen in hand, I felt like I was finally listening to myself without interruption. I wrote about my marriage, my mistakes, my silences. I wrote about the night I was asked to leave and the woman who walked out carrying a box and a lifetime of doubt. Writing didn't fix the past, but it reframed it. It gave meaning to pain that once felt senseless. Emily read some of my writing later. At my invitation, I made it clear she wasn't obligated. When she finished, she hugged me and said she'd never known how much I'd carried quietly. I told her that was partly my doing. Silence can feel like strength, but it often becomes a wall. She nodded, thoughtful. We were learning together, even now. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor who asked casually how my daughter was. I answered honestly, without the old defensiveness. I said she was well, growing, finding her way. As I spoke, I realized I no longer needed to present a polished version of our relationship. I didn't need to prove anything. That freedom felt like another milestone. The library invited me back to speak again, this time alongside others sharing stories of reinvention later in life. Listening to them, I recognized pieces of myself in every narrative: loss of roles, shifts in identity, the fear that it was too late to begin again. When it was my turn, I spoke about boundaries, about how love doesn't require self-erasure, about how being rejected by someone you love can either harden you or awaken you. I chose my words carefully, aware of how many people were listening for permission to change. After the event, a man approached me. He said his adult son hadn't spoken to him in years. He asked if reconciliation was always the goal. The question lingered with me. I told him that reconciliation can be a hope, but it doesn't have to be the destination. Sometimes peace comes from acceptance, not reunion. Sometimes loving someone means letting go of who you wish they'd be. He thanked me, eyes wet. I carried that exchange with me for days. Emily and I talked about that conversation later. She admitted she'd once assumed that parents existed solely to absorb pain, to forgive endlessly without needing repair. She said she saw now how unfair that was. Hearing that felt like another quiet healing, not triumphant, just right. Linda resurfaced briefly through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned she felt hurt and confused by Emily's distance. I felt no urge to intervene, explain, or mediate. That chapter no longer belonged to me. I wished Linda well silently and turned my attention back to my own life. That, too, was growth. As my birthday approached, Emily asked how I wanted to celebrate. The question itself felt significant. I told her I wanted something simple: a visit, a walk, time. When she came, we spent the day talking, laughing, and sharing stories that didn't revolve around past hurts. That night, as we sat on the porch, she said something quietly. She said, "I don't think I could have become who I am now if you hadn't stopped rescuing me." I didn't respond right away. I let the words settle. They weren't an apology or a thank you. They were an acknowledgement of change. That was enough. I've learned that closure doesn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It accumulates. It's found in ordinary days that no longer revolve around fear. It's found in conversations that don't require you to abandon yourself. It's found in the steady knowledge that you are allowed to take up space, to be complicated, to be whole. My daughter once asked me to leave her house. For a long time, I believed that moment defined me. Now I see it as the point where I finally stepped back into my own life. It didn't make me less of a mother. It made me more of a person. And from that place, love feels truer than it ever did before. If you're listening and you've been pushed aside, replaced, or made to feel like your presence is conditional, I want you to know this: you don't have to earn your worth by enduring pain. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from a place that no longer honors you, even if it once felt like home. There came a day when I realized I no longer told the story of what happened with my daughter as something that had been done to me. I told it as something that had changed me. The difference mattered. Victimhood keeps you tethered to the moment of hurt. Growth allows you to carry the memory without being defined by it. That shift didn't happen overnight, but when it did, it felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying longer than unrealized. Emily's life in her new city continued to unfold. She sent photos of the neighborhood, updates about her work, occasional voice notes when she felt overwhelmed. I listened, offered support when asked, and refrained from solving problems that weren't mine to solve. That restraint, once foreign to me, had become a form of respect for her and for myself. One evening, she called to tell me she and Jason were struggling, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, honest way. She said moving had brought old patterns to the surface, that she was learning how easily she defaulted to silence when things felt tense. As she spoke, I heard my younger self in her words. I resisted the urge to give advice. Instead, I asked her how she wanted to handle it. She paused, then said she wanted to try speaking up, even if it felt uncomfortable. I told her I trusted her judgment. When we hung up, I felt a quiet pride, not because she needed me, but because she didn't need rescuing. Around that time, I faced another moment of reckoning. My doctor suggested downsizing, mentioned that living in a smaller space might be easier as I aged. The suggestion stirred old fears of shrinking, of losing ground, of being pushed aside again. But when I considered it honestly, I realized the fear wasn't about space, it was about agency. This time, the choice would be mine. I toured a few places, asked questions, imagined possibilities. Eventually, I chose a small townhouse not far from the library. It felt right, not like a retreat, but a transition. Moving was emotional. I sorted through decades of belongings, deciding what to keep and what to release. I found photos of Emily as a child, school projects, notes I'd saved without remembering why. I allowed myself to grieve the years that had passed, the versions of myself I'd outgrown. Letting go didn't feel like loss, it felt like honoring what had been. Emily came to help me move. We worked side by side, no tension, no unspoken expectations. At one point, she found a box labeled letters. Inside were unsent letters I'd written during the divorce, during her college years, during the months after she asked me to leave. She asked if she could read one. I hesitated, then nodded. She read silently, tears slipping down her face. She didn't apologize afterward. She just hugged me and said, "I see you." That moment felt like a quiet resolution of something long unfinished. Settling into the townhouse, I noticed how much lighter my days felt. Less maintenance, less noise, more intention. I filled the walls with art that spoke to me, not what I thought others would like. I invited friends over without worrying about appearances. I was living in alignment, something I'd never prioritized before. Emily and I talked about the past less often now, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer dominated our present. When it did come up, it felt contextual, integrated. She once asked if I regretted not fighting harder when she told me to leave. I told her no. I said walking away had been the first boundary I'd ever set with her, and it had changed everything. She nodded, understanding that some lessons can't be taught, they have to be lived. Linda reached out again through an email. She wrote about wanting closure, about missing Emily, about feeling misunderstood. I read it once, then closed it. I didn't respond. Closure, I'd learned, isn't something you give others at the expense of yourself. It's something you cultivate internally. I wished her peace and moved on. As I unpacked the last box in my new home, I thought about how far I'd come from that night on the porch. The pain was still part of my story, but it no longer owned it. I had learned to live without waiting for validation, without centering my worth on someone else's approval. That freedom felt profound. Emily visited a few weeks later. We sat in the new space, comfortable, unhurried. She said I was glad I'd chosen this place, that it suited me. I smiled because the word chosen meant something different now. I told her I was glad too. If there's one truth I carry forward, it's this. Being cast out can become an invitation to reevaluate, to redefine, to reclaim. My daughter once chose her stepmother over me. That choice broke my heart, but it also broke open a life I'd been living too quietly, and in that opening, I found myself. The longer I lived in my new space, the more I understood that endings don't always announce themselves as such. Sometimes they arrive quietly, disguised as choices you finally make without fear. I stopped thinking of the townhouse as a downsizing and started thinking of it as a distillation. Everything here had a purpose. Everything reflected me. That sense of ownership over my life was something I'd never fully experienced before. Emily noticed it too. On one of her visits, she remarked on how peaceful the place felt. I told her peace isn't something you stumble into. It's something you build when you stop abandoning yourself. She smiled at that, like she was storing the words away for later. Our conversations now had a depth that didn't rely on crisis. We talked about books, about aging, about how strange it feels to watch your parents change. She asked me once if I was afraid of growing older alone. I thought about it before answering. I told her I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. I was afraid of being invisible, and that fear no longer had power over me. She reached for my hand, not in guilt, but in connection. Jason and I developed our own quiet understanding. He admitted one evening that he'd felt caught in the middle when Emily asked me to leave, that he hadn't known how to challenge her without making things worse. I told him I understood, but also told him that silence has consequences. He nodded, thoughtful. That conversation didn't erase the past, but it strengthened the present. One unexpected gift of this whole experience was how my friendships deepened. When I stopped centering my life entirely around my role as a mother, space opened for other relationships to grow. Friends I'd neglected became closer. New friendships formed around shared interests rather than shared history. I laughed more freely. I spoke more honestly. I felt seen in ways that had nothing to do with sacrifice. Emily faced another crossroads that year. She called me late one night, voice steady but serious. She said she and Jason were considering couples counseling, not because they were failing, but because they wanted to understand each other better before old patterns calcified. Hearing that, I felt a quiet pride. This was generational change in motion. She wasn't waiting for things to break before addressing them. She was choosing awareness. During that call, she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I think when I chose Linda over you, I was choosing the version of myself that didn't want to feel uncomfortable." She paused, then added, "And when you didn't chase me, you forced me to sit with that." I told her discomfort isn't the enemy, avoiding it is. We sat in silence for a moment, letting that truth breathe. As another year turned, I found myself reflecting less on what I'd lost and more on what I'd gained. Clarity, voice, a relationship with my daughter that felt mutual rather than obligatory. I no longer needed her to validate my worth, and because of that, our bond felt lighter, freer. I hosted a small gathering one evening, friends, neighbors, people from the library. As I looked around the room, listening to laughter, I felt a surge of gratitude, not for the pain that brought me here, but for the resilience it revealed. If you had told me years ago that being asked to leave my daughter's house would lead to this fullness, I would have thought you cruel. Now I see it differently. Some losses are invitations in disguise. Emily called me the next morning to thank me for the evening. She said it felt good to see me so alive, so centered. I told her I felt that way too, and I meant it. There are still moments when the old ache surfaces, when I see a mother and daughter laughing together in a way that reminds me of what once was. I let the ache pass. I don't judge it. Love leaves traces. That doesn't mean it owns you. My daughter once threw me out of her house and chose her stepmother over me. That sentence used to feel like a verdict. Now it feels like context, a chapter, not the whole book. What followed was harder than I ever imagined, but it was also truer than anything I'd lived before. If there's a moral to all of this, it's not about blame or redemption. It's about courage. the courage to stop shrinking, the courage to let go of roles that cost you your self-respect, the courage to believe that even after rejection, you are still worthy of love that doesn't require you to disappear. I don't know what the final chapters of my life will hold. None of us do. But I know this. I will meet them standing in my own space, speaking in my own voice, loving without erasing myself. And that finally feels like coming home. The most profound change didn't happen all at once. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, until one morning I realized it had taken root. I no longer feared being alone. I no longer measured my worth by someone else's choices or affections. The nights that once felt endless and hollow now carried a quiet peace. I could sit with myself, sip my coffee, watch the sunlight fall across my new home, and simply exist without guilt, without longing, without regret. That kind of calm doesn't come easily, but it lasts, and when it does, you realize that the pain you endured wasn't a sentence, it was a teacher. Emily called that morning. She was calm, almost gentle in a way that had taken years to cultivate. She told me about a conversation she'd had with Jason, one where they admitted their mistakes to each other and committed to more honesty. She asked my advice, not to fix things for her, but to consider options, to think critically. I told her what I thought, yes, but I spoke from a place of experience, not obligation. I realized that giving advice now felt different. It didn't feel like the old sacrifice where my happiness depended on her compliance. It was offering insight from a place of clarity, of freedom, and she listened. Later that afternoon, I walked through my garden, something I'd neglected for years. Hands in soil, I thought about how much growth comes after pruning, after letting go of what no longer serves you. My roses had bloomed abundantly this year, despite the hard winter we'd had. It reminded me that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulty, it's about enduring it, learning from it, and allowing yourself to bloom again. Just as my roses had weathered frost, so had I. Emily came to visit a few days later. She arrived carrying homemade bread, her laugh light, her presence thoughtful. We cooked together, not as mother and child trying to reclaim a past, but as two adults navigating a new dynamic. We talked about plans, fears, ambitions. We reminisced briefly about the painful past, but we did not dwell. There was acknowledgement without judgment, memory without fixation. That distinction made all the difference. During her visit, she asked me why I hadn't chased her all those years ago, why I'd accepted the hurt without fighting for my place. I thought about it long before answering. I told her the truth. Chasing her would have taught her that boundaries don't matter, that my love was conditional on her needs and whims. Walking away, as painful as it was, forced both of us to confront our truths. She sat quietly, letting the words settle. She nodded slowly. That silence was understanding. That silence was respect. We shared stories late into the evening. Laughter came easily now, unburdened by the fear that joy might provoke conflict. She told me about her fears, about how she sometimes still second-guesses herself, about the pressure of navigating relationships with adults who shaped her childhood memories. I shared mine, not as complaints, not as blame, but as lessons, as history. By the time the night ended, we were two adults with a shared past, tempered by pain, strengthened by honesty, and connected by a love that had been tested and survived. After Emily left, I sat in my favorite chair reflecting on the journey. The truth became undeniable. Being cast out had saved me in a way I didn't understand at the time. The act that had felt like rejection forced me to reclaim my life, my boundaries, my voice. I had spent decades giving, bending, adjusting, accommodating. That night on the porch had felt like the end, but it was actually the beginning. beginning of autonomy, beginning of awareness, beginning of self-love. Months later, I received a message from a woman who had followed my story at one of the library talks. She wrote about her own estrangement from her adult daughter and asked how I'd survived the initial emptiness. I replied with what had become my truth: survive first, rebuild second, and let love find its way afterward. Don't cling to the past. Don't shrink to accommodate others' fears. Take up space, speak, rest, love yourself relentlessly. Sometimes, when you're brave enough to do that, reconciliation follows naturally, or you find peace without it. Emily called that week again, her voice lighter, less anxious. She spoke about a challenge at work and asked how I'd approach it. I listened, offered suggestions when asked, then encouraged her to trust herself. We hung up, and I felt an unfamiliar yet grounding pride. Not because I'd solved her problem, but because she was standing firmly in hers, and that was all either of us needed. I thought about Linda one day while pruning the roses. She had reached out sporadically over the years, but her words no longer carried weight. I understood her now, not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as someone whose choices were hers to make, just as mine were mine. I felt no resentment, only acknowledgement that boundaries are love, sometimes for ourselves first. As the years passed, Emily and I continued to navigate life together, but differently than before. We celebrated milestones without expectation. We checked in without obligation. We shared the quiet moments without filling them with the need to prove devotion. And in that space, our love matured, free from the old anxieties that had once threatened it. Reflecting on the entire journey, I realized that being thrown out of my daughter's house was not the end of my story. It was the pivotal turning point. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, to grieve deeply, and ultimately rebuild myself. I became stronger, wiser, more present. I learned that being a mother does not mean erasing yourself. It means modeling courage, self-respect, and integrity. And now, when I think of the woman standing with a box in her arms that night, I feel compassion and gratitude. She endured more than she knew. She learned what boundaries were, and she carried that knowledge forward into the life she was meant to live. I have come full circle, not to the past I lost, but to the life I reclaimed. If you are listening, and if someone has pushed you away or made you feel less than, understand this: your value is not determined by the choices of others. Being left behind may feel devastating, but it can also be liberating. Sometimes the people who turn away are the ones who inadvertently show you how to step fully into yourself. And when you do, when you claim your space, your voice, your life, you might find that love in its most honest and powerful form can follow, or that peace without it is more than enough. I am no longer the woman who waited on a porch with a box of belongings. I am the woman who took back her life, who learned to say no, who discovered the power of her own presence. I am a mother, yes, but I am also a whole, independent, resilient human being, and that finally feels like freedom. There is a strange kind of quiet that comes after storms, one that is neither empty nor lonely, but full of the space to breathe, to reflect, and to rebuild. That quiet has become my companion in recent years. The woman I once was, fragile, anxious, desperate to be chosen, no longer occupies the center of my story. I have learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, that life does not hinge on being wanted by others. Life hinges on being present for yourself, fiercely and without apology. And in that presence, I have found freedom I never imagined possible. Looking back on the years that followed Emily asking me to leave, I realize how much I misunderstood the nature of love. I thought love required sacrifice without boundaries, that it demanded self-erasure to preserve the happiness of others. I thought enduring pain silently made me a good mother, but I was wrong. I've learned that true love, whether for a child, a partner, or even a friend, does not demand that you vanish. True love honors boundaries, values integrity, and respects the wholeness of everyone involved. Emily and I now share a bond that is far richer than the one we had before. It is not built on proximity or habitual obligation. It is built on honesty, choice, and mutual respect. There are still moments of tension, of course. Old patterns do not disappear entirely. She sometimes defaults to fear or self-doubt, and I sometimes find myself slipping into the old habit of over-explaining or accommodating. But now, these moments are brief and acknowledged rather than internalized. They are signals, not verdicts, and we navigate them together, not through avoidance or guilt, but through communication. This transformation in our relationship was never about winning her back or reclaiming a role. It was about discovering what I needed to stand tall in my own life. The act of being asked to leave, harsh as it felt at the time, was a catalyst. It forced me to confront the truths I had been avoiding, that I had been shrinking myself for too long, that my happiness had been contingent on the approval of others, that love without boundaries can be more damaging than distance. The experience, as painful as it was, became the mirror that reflected my neglected self. Through all of this, I have also come to understand the importance of letting go of resentment. For years, I carried anger toward Linda, toward Robert, even toward Emily at times. I replayed conversations, imagined confrontations, and measured injustices over and over. That anger became a weight, one I did not realize I was dragging through every day. Releasing it did not mean excusing anyone's behavior. It did not mean forgetting the hurt. It meant reclaiming energy, choosing focus, and freeing myself from the invisible chains of expectation and blame. It meant understanding that the only person I can truly control in life is myself. I have also learned the value of self-care in its truest sense, not as indulgence, not as guilt-free distraction, but as a deliberate act of honoring myself. I wake up early to write, I spend afternoons tending to my garden, I walk in the park without rushing, listen to music without distraction, and cook meals that nourish both body and soul. These routines are not trivial. They are deliberate acts of self-preservation and self-respect. They remind me daily that I am worthy of care, that I matter, and that my presence is valid in the world. Emily and I continue to redefine what family means to us. Family is not merely who lives under the same roof or shares DNA. It is who communicates honestly, who respects your limits, who celebrates your victories without expectation, who allows you to be fully yourself without manipulation or guilt. In that understanding, we have built something beautiful and lasting, a mother-daughter relationship that can weather disagreement, distance, and mistakes because it is rooted in mutual recognition, not dependence. Through this journey, I have realized that one of the greatest gifts we can give to those we love is permission. Permission to grow, permission to stumble, permission to set boundaries. I see now that my stepping back after Emily asked me to leave was my first act of giving her that permission, and unknowingly, it gave me permission too. Permission to grieve, to rebuild, to reclaim, and to love on my own terms. The power of choice became clear. I could choose despair, resentment, and shrinking myself, or I could choose awareness, strength, and flourishing. I chose the latter, and it has carried me further than I ever imagined. One of the most striking realizations from this journey is that reconciliation and forgiveness are processes, not events. They are cultivated over time, often quietly in ordinary interactions that carry extraordinary meaning. They are not about forgetting or erasing harm. They are about acknowledging what was, understanding how it shaped everyone involved, and deciding how you want to proceed. Forgiveness became less about Emily or Linda and more about myself, about unshackling from the past, about embracing the woman I had become through all the trials. I have also discovered that love can be abundant. I no longer felt the fear that if Emily prioritized someone else, my love would be insufficient. I realized love multiplies when it is not tied to control. The more I allowed her space to grow, the deeper our connection became. The more I nurtured myself, the more fully I could engage in relationships without needing constant validation. This paradox, that letting go strengthens bonds, was one of the hardest lessons to learn, but ultimately the most rewarding. In quiet moments, I sometimes reflect on the woman who once sat on that porch with a box of her belongings, feeling small, rejected, and hopeless. I do not feel shame for her, I feel compassion and pride. She survived a heartbreak that could have consumed her, and in doing so, she discovered a strength she did not know existed. She learned that her voice mattered, that her boundaries mattered, and that her life could be rich and meaningful without anyone else's permission. If I could speak to anyone listening who has experienced rejection or estrangement, I would say this: being cast aside does not erase your worth. Being replaced or overlooked does not diminish your value. Often, what feels like an ending is simply the beginning of a life lived intentionally. Take the time to sit with your grief, but do not let it define you. Nurture yourself, reclaim your agency, speak your truth, and know that the love you deserve begins with how you treat yourself. Emily and I will continue to navigate life's twists and turns, as all families do. There will be disagreements, missteps, and moments of tension, but there will also be laughter, shared memories, and quiet afternoons where we simply enjoy being in each other's presence. That, I have learned, is the essence of enduring love, not perfection, not sacrifice without acknowledgement, but mutual respect, honesty, and the courage to be fully present in one's own life. I am no longer the woman who felt invisible, who questioned her worth based on the whims of others. I am no longer defined by the night I was asked to leave or the years spent longing for approval. I am a whole, resilient, and self-aware woman who has discovered her own strength, reclaimed her voice, and learned the power of boundaries and self-respect. And in this reclamation, I have found freedom, dignity, and a love for my daughter that is deeper, calmer, and truer than I ever imagined. In the end, the story is not about who chose whom or about betrayal or abandonment. It is about survival, transformation, and the profound lessons that emerge when life forces you to confront your own limits. It is about realizing that love does not require erasing yourself, that peace does not require reconciliation, that strength is found not in how others treat you, but in how you treat yourself when no one else is watching. So if you find yourself at the edge, pushed aside, or questioning your value, remember this: your story is not over. Being asked to leave a place or a relationship may feel like a judgment, but it can also be the most important turning point in your life. It can be the moment when you finally choose yourself, when you claim your voice, when you allow yourself to thrive. It is never too late to rebuild, to heal, and to live fully. And for me, that is exactly what I did. I reclaimed my life. I rebuilt my sense of self. I nurtured my own growth and the growth of my daughter. And in the process, I discovered a love that is unshakable, a peace that is enduring, and a strength that I had never known I possessed. I am the woman who survived being thrown out. I am the mother who learned the power of boundaries. I am the human who discovered that the greatest love, both for others and for oneself, comes from choosing to be whole, brave, and unapologetically present in one's own life. And that, finally, is the ending I had been waiting for all along.